Hello, everyone. Welcome and good whatever moment of this wonderful day you are enjoying on your time zones. It is such a joy to welcome you to yet another conversation part of our February series. And I was just thinking today that after what felt like years and years of January, February just flew by in a heartbeat. Today, we will be talking about ethics in action, and even more importantly, about navigating HR's toughest dilemmas. My name is Minola Jacques. I am your co host for the next hour. We have our wonderful Jessa working her magic backstage. It is quite a gloomy, rainy afternoon here in Switzerland, where I am hosting all of you from. And I was very, very much looking forward to this conversation. Knowing the speakers, I am sure that it will feel like sunshine. Now, I do want to welcome everybody in the audience. And just a quick request for help. Oh, I already see comments coming in, so please keep those coming. Just let us know where you're watching us or listening from, and drop your location and help us travel vicariously around the world. And it also helps us know that we are not stuck in some back loop on LinkedIn, and it's all up and running. Jessa, please help me make the most out of our time today and bring the speakers on the screen. And while they get used to seeing their faces next to each other, I will continue to welcome everybody in the audience and also wholeheartedly encourage you to consider the comments your own conversation space. So whatever it is that we are discussing on the stage with the panelists, drop your own take on the topic, drop your ideas, and help this community grow and learn from all of us. At the same time, if you can think of some questions, drop them. But the disclaimer there is that we will try to bring them in our conversation as much as possible and as soon as possible. But we can't possibly squeeze into 1 hour all the wonderful questions that we receive from the audience. Now, I will start us off. And you are friends of Hacking HR, you're panel veterans, so you know the drill. What I will do, I will pass the e-mic around as you appear on my screen, clockwise, and I will ask you to, firstly, shortly introduce yourselves, and also, I would ask you to share with our audience what is your personal meaning of ethics that you bring into our conversation today. And Evelyn, it's so great to see you again. Welcome. Please start us off.
Hello, Manola. I'm Evelyn, and I've been doing HR for over 15 years, currently sitting as the Senior HR Director overseeing US and Canada for Jason Strategic Merchandising. And what I bring to the conversation about ethics is one of the things I hold near and dear and that I practice and preach with my team is that you have to have a set of standards and morals personally so that you can express them and explore them professionally. And you always need to have limits set in place so you can know where a line and limit is for you, and be able to drive that appropriately professionally and personally as well. So and I encourage that across my team and across the fields that I support.
Thank you so very much, Evelyn. So good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here. I'm Sue Sands. I am the HR Director for Consumer Direct Care Network. We employ over about 90,000 employees across the U.S. One thing I think of when I think of ethics, the one thing that comes to mind is do the right thing. Always do the right thing for the people, for the company. If you take that path, then you're going to be great.
Thank you so very much. Joy, welcome. Good to have you here on this conversation.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Joy Roscoe. I'm the Senior Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager for United Way for Greater Austin. My background is in training and development, program management, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And ethics for me means knowing what you will and won't do and making sure you're doing the right thing as much as possible. Making sure that when you make decisions that you are aware of who it will impact, who was in the room to make said decision, and making sure that you are making a choice that ultimately will benefit as many as possible.
Thank you. Jamie, hello.
Good morning, good afternoon. Hi, Manola. Nice to see you again. Shout out to my Austin people. Joy, glad you're here. I see that there's some awesome people in the chat. My name's Jamie Conrad. I'm an HR professional with about 16 years of HR experience. I currently work with Trust Radius as their VP of People in HR, and I'm enjoying the ride in the tech industry right now. For me, ethics leans into integrity and how I show up with my own integrity to the business that I'm supporting at the time. I had someone that I care about and that I trust tell me a long time ago in my career to never sacrifice my own integrity for someone else's. And so that is the kind of the mantra that I live by when it comes to ethics in business.
Thank you. And last but not least, making this panel complete, Steve, welcome.
Thank you. I would start, I mean, two sides to this. I think one on the personal ethics side, I agree with what Evelyn said. It's really knowing, that you have a certain set of standards and you live by them. And it's like how you act when no one is looking kind of thing. So have that. But I think in the organizational side, I'm a psychologist. So it's more, I think, on like procedural justice, and that it's having clear, transparent processes that are consistently followed so employees know the rules of the game. And I do think it gets interesting because I work for SAP, it's globally. When it comes to sort of like our process is ethical, that's where it gets really complicated, because in some countries I saw a DEI, I think, that showed that you go from groups that go from protected class to criminally illegal, depending on what country you go to. So it gets really complicated on, is a process ethical? But once you've decided what the process is, ethical implementation of that process is transparency, consistency. Even if somebody doesn't agree with the process, at least they know what it is. So.
Thank you so very much. And just a quick ask for help from all the panelists. If we can stay muted when not contributing, because that would save us from echo and a bit of background noise. And my secret will be out. That's also my cue as a facilitator when you want to jump into the conversation. Before we dive very, very deep into the topic, I was looking at the title of the panel, and I somehow got locked into this toughest dilemmas. All the conversation we've been having throughout the January and February series, every single panelist talked about how the realities and the challenges and equally the opportunities of HR have been transforming. And I would really invite all of you, if we can take a few minutes and just look at what are some of the toughest dilemmas for HR that you see in our workplaces today? And in what way, if any, are they different from, I don't know, maybe before the pandemic, or if you can take any other time reference or event reference in mind? And I don't know why I do this, but I do this every single time. I always go diagonally. So Joy, I will ask you to kick us off on this one. And then everybody, the unmuting competition will be officially open, and just build your own conversation. So Joy.
Thank you. So this question, to me, when I think about HR's toughest dilemmas, I don't necessarily think it's tough in the notion of what do we do. I feel like it's new challenges that are arising for HR post-pandemic, because the pandemic really allowed us to take a moment and see the humanity of people. There historically has been a track record of you go to work, you do your job, you go home, and the rest of the world around you just has to stop. But when everyone had that moment to really stop and sit with something that was affecting all of us, it wasn't something that could be seen as an individual challenge or an individual dilemma. We had to then adjust to essentially this new world of realizing we're people when we are walking into these organizations. And so there is a little bit of a catch up. It's looking at what are our policies, what are our processes? Are they people focused? Have we always been taking the most equitable approach to how we navigated the workplace? And I think when we look at HR and we're talking about what is really the ethics around HR. A part of that is about accountability. And I think this is just a time of accountability, and that can feel a little challenging. It can feel weird. It can feel different. But I think that's when you summarize it as tough. It's really just a new space that we're navigating in.
Thank you, Joy. Where shall we go next? Evelyn, do you wanna? Yeah.
Sure. I was just sitting here nodding my head to Joy because I agree wholeheartedly. I think COVID definitely allowed us to pause and reflect on what we were doing, what we could improve upon, and then also realign what's important to us as individuals. And then with that, reprioritizing how we spent our days now. And so now that's why you see a lot of shifts in how employees are showing up at work, or how employers have to accommodate certain things, because employees are no longer in the middle of just, I got to go to work, much to what Joyce said, got to go to work, go home and do this. Now it's more of, no, my family has this event and that's more important to me than going to work, or I need to shift my schedule now, or working from home has been a big thing, remote work and flexibility in remote work. Employers are now having to really justify and identify where they may have had hard stances in the past, how they can move forward in the future to not only keep their business lively and help moving forward, but also retain their employees, right? Those talents, because now they have options. And those options are before it was global, but it's even more global now with COVID, because with employers changing their stance on certain things, people are ready to jump ship and go here and try these, or try new things that they probably would not have tried pre-COVID, should I say. And so I think from an HR standpoint, where a lot of the dilemma comes in is, and much to what Steve had mentioned before, is figuring out transparency. And then identifying where the hard stop is, so that way we can communicate that transparently. And not, I think a lot of times we've seen where companies had one line and then communicating, and now you're seeing them backpedal, like, oh, well, we don't want that anymore, or oh, we can't do that anymore. And so that's causing conflict, because you communicated you're doing this, you're transparent, and now you change. And so now you have to really have accountability in who you're presenting yourself to be.
Sue.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Joy and Evelyn said. And I think not just COVID, but everything that's happened over the last few years, there's more visibility for, more prominence in, different communities, just because of recent events that happened. So I think HR has shifted into more of a people-centric world. It's no longer about processes and making sure that we're following the procedures. It's like we really have to start looking at the people it affects, the people that everything we do affects a person or a group of people. And I think we have to start looking at, changing our policies and changing our practices to be able to support those groups. We do have a lot of diverse workplaces now, and we have to be able to, set those policies so that they are ethical to all groups and not just, black and white policies. It's either right or wrong. That's not the case anymore.
I hope I saw the sequence correct. So Jamie and then Steve.
Yeah, and Sue, I agree with that when you think about leaning into policies. Going back to what Evelyn said in her introduction around knowing where your lines are, and when you're trying to create policies internally, challenging those policies of manager, right? You're coming to me with a situation. Am I really going to fire somebody because of XYZ? And if the answer is not absolutely, then let's talk about that. If it's not a gross misconduct, are we really going to let somebody go for violating this policy? If the answer is not absolutely, then there's some room in there to create a more human-centric and employee-centric policy that allows for you to still achieve those business incomes or outcomes without having to sacrifice the people experience. So I think we're in that, but I also feel like there's a lot of day-to-day opportunities where our ethics can be challenged in HR just from our normal work and some of the tasks that we're responsible for. And it's refreshing that after the pandemic and some of the social unrest and the things that we're experiencing together, that if there is a silver lining, and I'm a silver linings kind of person, about the pandemic, it is bringing us together in that commonality, which is great. But that also means there's a whole bunch of ways that we can take it and run with it. And so if we have an opportunity, and that's our responsibility from an action standpoint, is when we are presented with those opportunities to make a difference and how the business is displaying ethics, morals, integrity to employees and as a corporation, that's where our voice can really be impactful in our daily work.
Steve.
Okay. Wow. It's great to go last on this because I get to listen to what everyone else says. I think, first of all, and I agree with obviously what everyone says. I think a couple of things that were interesting. I think Jamie talking about the individual managers things. I think that's one of the things that ethics is, that we should give managers more flexibility. But when you give flexibility, a lot of people confuse consistency with fairness, and consistency, treating everyone exactly the same, isn't fair. But then you do run into the fact that some managers make decisions that probably we'd say, why are you so controlling, right? And as opposed to others were like, give more flexibility. So that's at a micro level. At a macro level, and just the nature of my work, I work more at sort of the macro level with sort of the organizations across the organization. I think the really big places where ethics play out are what are called the high stake decisions that companies make. And that's pay, staffing, including downsizing. I think this is a really big one we don't talk enough. We always focus on hiring. We don't focus on letting go. And so pay, staffing, including layoffs. And then a big one right now is remote work and hybrid work. And I think what the challenge is that because of a variety of things, one is being the labor market to solve, employees are a lot more empowered now to step up and say, this is BS. Why are you doing this? And they can do it in a very public forum. And so I think in the past, they just kind of sucked it up and goes, yeah, work sucks. So, well, welcome to life. And now it's like, no, the culture has shifted. And I want to say, this isn't a generational change. I think I suspect that my parents wanted to complain about work too, but the labor market was different, and so that they're more empowered. And I think where HR is put in this position of often business leaders make decisions that can't really be explained in a transparent way, and then they force HR to do it. And I mean, remote work is a really good example on that one. I've known a lot of HR leaders where a business leader basically, because I'm going to be really cynical, when they walk into the office, they want to see everyone around them. They're never in the office, but when they come through, it's depressing to walk through an empty office. So, we have all this real estate, and I'm being kind of cynical, but I think there's some truth to that. And then they tell HR, okay, everyone back in the office for a certain set amount of time. They say why, and they and you could argue for the next 20 years about, is it good, bad, blah, blah, blah. I'd say you should give maximum flexibility personally, but then HR has to explain it. And I talk to these HR leaders and they're like, and it's one of these decisions, as your kid, when you're with your parents say, you've got to do this. That's not fair. And they're like, why do I have to do it? Because mom said you have to do it. Well, that's what the CEO is kind of doing. You have to be back in the office because the CEO said you had to do it. But HR is the one who has to explain it. And HR is the one who's supposed to be empathetic and trusting. And it creates a real dilemma, I think, for HR, where they are forced to explain things that they can't actually explain. And this plays out in pay. This plays out in downsizing decisions. I think HR, and it's the challenge of our job. I think it's, to your point, like, it's focused on people. It's very hard to engage the people when we have to explain a process that in some cases, I don't think we even fully understand. Some of these decisions are made in rooms where we should be at the table, but we're not at the table. And then it's like, okay, here's the restructuring. Go out and explain it, make everyone excited about it. And you're like, ah. So I think that's the ethical dilemma. We're stuck between people and process.
Jamie, I saw you unmuted there. You want to jump back in?
Yeah, as supported by the recent TikTok viral video about the lady that was let go and HR on the phone trying to navigate the situation when it was apparent, at least to me, that HR was probably not in the room when the decision was made to have a RIF. They probably weren't in the conversation about who was being impacted and why it was all happening. And so I think that's a really good example supporting what you're saying, Steve, that we need to be part of those conversations, number one. And if we're not, then how do we effectively navigate the business and the people effectively?
Because if we don't, we destroy our trust. And if employees don't trust HR, then you were really screwed as HR function. And pardon my language, but I mean, it's like, I think that's such a good point. I think that somehow we have to, communicate more clearly that we can't be effective as a function if people just view us as a tool of corporate.
Yeah. Evelyn.
Oh no, I was agreeing with everything they said. And one of the things that's so funny because my stance on remote work has always been, I love it. I want to do it all the time. Until I had to really dive into the payroll aspect of remote work and the complexities that it brings that sometimes aren't always communicated or discussed. So although I champion remote work, I also understand the heavy workload and complexities that go into it. Actually, was just sitting on a webinar and it's like, wow, I thought we were doing everything right. And now I have some things I have to go back to see, like, wait, do we do this? Do we do? And, with laws constantly changing now, to accommodate some of these things or to backpedal on some of these things, in some cases, it goes back to the initial part of transparency and communication, right? So although it's easy to say come back into the office, but what is the true reason for coming back into the office? Is it because you just want to see everyone's face, or is it because you're not structurally set up to do so? And if so, let's have that honest conversation and what plans you have in place to fix or not fix it, and what are your focal points? And I think a lot of times that's what's missing in these conversations is the honest transparency and communication, and just fall back onto what Steve was saying, like just do it because I said so, versus you do it because we're not set up structurally or compliantly to do this, and so we have to kind of move forward in this direction until we can get to that stage, and that may be some time.
I can definitely see how flex work can be the topic of an entire series, not just of a panel. But building on everything that you just mentioned, I would also like to bring into this conversation two key points that were mentioned time and time again. One, that HR at the end of the day sits on confidential, sensitive data. Second, that in many cases, HR performs its work by influencing without authority. So a lot of negotiations going there, a lot of advocating, a lot of relationship building. So bringing these 2 points into the conversation and everything that you just mentioned, how do all these influence how HR ethics shows up in workplace? And I would ask Sue to lead us into this. How is ethics, the HR flavor of ethics, special?
I think it's because not everyone can do HR. So the HR folks that I know have very strong ethics, and they're in their positions because of that. And I think they're able to influence the leaders of the company to do the right thing, look at their decisions and make sure that it is impacting the greater good, and also being flexible enough that we can tailor it if we need to impact the greater good. So it may be something that the leaders want to do, but I think it takes HR to have a voice in that and to make sure that they are being ethical in their decisions.
I would agree, and I would also add that some of it with HR is understanding. Like one of the things I always ask, what are the limits? What are the constraints? Because we can be creative in those limits and constraints. I think sometimes people hear limits and just get turned off, or like, oh, we can't do that. I hear limits and say, okay, you didn't say I can't do this though. So how can we be creative in that perspective? And then communicating that out with my employees. Like there's an issue with my employees, I'm quick to say, okay, here's what we can and cannot do. And based on what we can do, what does ideal goal looks like for you? So that way I know what they're looking for versus what we can do. And then now we can meet somewhere in the middle. And I always say, we may not be able to hit all your points, but my goal is to get us somewhere in the middle so we both walk away happy. And I do that, cross board. And I found that to be amicable versus, going in guns a-blazing, don't do this, don't do that. It's more of, okay, here's our flexibility. How can we wiggle within that?
And I want to piggyback on that and going even further of knowing where the quote unquote limits are, but also knowing what are the desirable outcomes, because I think that will also be super supportive when we are trying to be innovative and we're trying to be creative with what are the solutions, what can we do, and how do we navigate within those limits so that as we go back to that table with that individual, maybe it's a manager, maybe it's a team member, maybe it's an executive, we can lead with, this is what we know you wanted to do. This is where we know you wanted to go. This is how we can navigate within that space with also still being compliant and having that policy and process in place without sacrificing the integrity and the confidentiality of the information that you may have access to.
I agree with all these points, and I want to lean back into something Steve said from the last question, and that's around trust, right? And it's so important for HR to build trust and have influence in the organization at every single level. So there's not a lot of wiggle room for us when it comes to ethics and integrity and our decision-making process. We have to know exactly where our limits are. We can work within the limits of the business or the limits of the leader, and we can focus on the outcomes. But there's not wiggle room for me as an HR professional to slide on my ethical decisions or slide just a little bit on my integrity when I come to the conversation. Because if we don't have trust at every single level, just like Steve said, we're not going to be able to influence in a way that makes us effective.
Yeah. Can I build on that? I think, Jamie, what you're saying, I think it's a really good point. I think when you look at HR and you're talking to business leaders, there's like two sides of kind of HR. One is, no, you can't do that because it's illegal. That's the stick, right? But I think the more powerful one, Jamie, you're saying is that, no, you can't do that because in this world, not just to engage people, but for people to be in a learning environment, be adaptable, be agile, all the things that you need them to be as a business leader, they have to trust us. They have to trust that we're on their side. And if we violate that trust, it's not just about them leaving. It's about them literally, you can't execute your strategies because they don't trust you anymore. And if you turn everything transactional, you're not going to be a successful company. And I think that's where HR, I work with a lot of HR leaders across a lot of companies, and I say there's really big differences in how comfortable HR is willing to take up that ownership. And going to what Sue said, we're not just experts in policy, we're experts in people. You wouldn't push back on your CFO if they said this is the most effective way to manage the money. Yet when they do push back on us, we say this is the most effective way to manage people. I mean, I'm a psychologist. Is the bane of being a psychologist is, well, I understand people. And you're like, well, if you did at the level I did, you'd realize what you're doing is stupid. Kind of there, it is an expertise, but I think we're not respected yet. I mean, it varies. We have to build that respect. We have to gain that respect as experts in getting people to do stuff. And I don't mean that in a manipulative way. I mean that in like a engaged way and all those sorts of things. And I think that's I think that is one of the big challenges. I think the other challenge on the ethics of the employees, that's talking to the leaders. I think the other is in explaining to employees this idea of transparency and flexibility. But part of it, I think sometimes we don't talk enough to employees about, look, you work in a social group, and I think about performance this way. The biggest reason we need to manage performance is not about that individual. It's about the impact that individual has on other people in the team. And there's a lot of, you can look in this. I mean, which is why actually, if you want to increase team performance, focus on the low performers, not the high. This whole idea of focus on it actually is not true. High performers will take care of themselves. But I think that's a lot of the times when we get into the ethics and dealing with this issue, we don't focus enough on we're managing a community. We're not managing individuals and thinking about it that way.
Piggyback. So I really like what you said there, Steve, about how we're expert in people. And I think that that makes HR the best advocate of people. I want to go as far as say we have the ability to advocate for the people that essentially we're managing. And so when we're going into these rooms with leaders or different decision makers, I feel like that really speaks to our ethics and our integrity to not say what we think they may want to hear, but what they need to hear. That essentially, if we do X, Y, and Z, this is how it's going to impact you. And oftentimes we talk potentially, you know, depending on the culture of your organization or who you're talking to and to the leader, they may have more focus on the money and the dimes and, you know, that part of it. But I think that's why we need to get very specific in showing that this individual is going to impact all of the things that you are holding personally important. And that's why you have to focus on the people, because if you are not people centric and thinking of the decision that you're making, none of the dollar and cents are going to matter because you're not going to have the people to drive that forward. So I think just in looking at that personal brand and flavoring, as you put it, of what is the personal brand or flavor of, you know, HR, I think it's to be true advocates of the people and bring that expertise that others in the room may not have.
Mm. Well, believe it or not, we just entered the second half of our conversation today. It's absolutely mind-blowing how fast time passes when there's so much passion on the panel. And I would just like to take a few seconds and welcome everybody who joined a little bit later. And for those of you who joined late or those of you who need to drop off a little bit early, don't worry, this conversation is being recorded and you can always go back and listen or recommend it either from our LinkedIn space or the hackinghrlab.io platform. I was listening to our conversation and, you know, hybrid remote flex work popped up with wonderful energy to discuss it. We touched on data and analytics. I would like to bring Gen AI into the conversation and just invite all of you to take a few minutes and talk about what are some of these elements or new developments that really impact the workplace and feed into the conversation around HR ethics. Jamie, would you like to lead us into this, please?
One of my favorite current events right now, generative AI and the impact in the workplace. So from an HR ethics standpoint, I think there's a lot of different ways that we can slice and dice the effect of generative AI. Number one is DEIB efforts and how generative AI can help to break down some of those biases if we are diligent in how we're utilizing and leaning into generative AI. I also think that it's changing the way that we talk about competencies and skills, not just at the hiring process, but across the board. Professional development, personal development, and what skills are going to be important going forward. How we're talking about productivity and accountability, efficiencies that we're gaining, and what that looks like for our workforce, for talent management and talent planning, from headcount forecasting. All of those things, it's starting to come up in a lot of different areas across the business. And it's changing the way that we look at the future of work. When it comes to the ethics of it, I think we have a responsibility as HR leaders to be at the forefront of the conversations around the impacts of generative AI on business, because it does play into the people aspect. We've got an opportunity here to help us evolve and be innovative in our use of generative AI and not let the fears of it get in the way. But that means we also have a responsibility around what those parameters look like, how strict our policies are, where are we encouraging, what are we encouraging, how are we encouraging, and not allowing us to, again, as a business, slide on any of those ethical decisions on how we're utilizing it. That includes people analytics and people data. Making sure that we have humans that can interpret that data and anything that generative AI spits out, to verify and validate what we're getting. But there is a lot of opportunity for efficiency gains, and I think that it's okay for us to lean into that as it changes and influences the world of work.
I want to piggyback.
I think
Oh.
we lost you there for a second, Joy. When you said I'll piggyback, and then we lost you.
Well, I'm one of the people affected by AT&T, so my apologies. I was saying I wanted to piggyback on that because I think that AI does definitely have a place in HR, and I think that it is definitely making it more efficient. But on that, I do want to caution people to not be solely reliant on AI because it is a new software that we are implementing. That means that it is pulling from other sources. And if historically those processes or sources have not been, I would say, people-centric to everyone, that it can sway in or have a negative impact on your decision. And I will take recruiting, for example. I think we all know about applicant tracking systems. However, when you look at applicant tracking systems and you're saying, okay, it pulls from a list of words on a resume potentially, and it generates the top candidates. Well, if you are someone that is wanting to diversify your workforce, or maybe there are certain sets of skill sets or core competencies that you are wanting to expand and look for, if you solely rely on this AI or this generated information, you could be missing a whole pocket of valuable talent. So that's just one example of how AI can impact. So I'll say definitely use it to make some of your processes and data aggregation more efficient, but also don't be solely reliant on AI to the point that it can have an adverse effect.
I agree with everything that Joy and Jamie said. I think one of the things, I mean, AI is a very, very useful tool, and I'm so happy that it's available for us. But one thing AI misses is the ethical principles of being a human-centric company or human-centric environment in the world that we live in. Transparency is one of those ethical principles. I mean, you know, you can use AI for a lot of things, but does it promote the transparency that we want to promote in, you know, this new world of HR and business? Also fairness and bias, like Joy said. You know, you can use AI tools, but you have to make sure that you're using it in a fair and unbiased manner. And just, you know, the human piece of AI, AI is a great tool, but there's no human piece in it. And I think we have to step back and use that tool, but also make sure that we're using it appropriately in regards to ethics.
I would echo all that they say, and also add that one thing I like about AI is the efficiency it brings, but it also is a tool that is shifting, I think, the views of what people think HR should be, and that it's allowing to remove away a lot of those tactical and transactional things that HR have historically done, and allowing for HR to be better business partners, better leaders, and better decision makers in the people space, because they're able to focus more on those things versus all of the other things that fell under the HR umbrella, whether intentionally or unintentionally, but they fall. And so I think utilizing tools like AI has helped offload a lot of that and give more focus to those spaces from HR. So I think it's, and I do agree with the being very cautious of the biases that it may bring as well. So being aware of those as you're utilizing it. But I know for myself, one of the things we use it for is more on the tactical side to streamline efficiencies and automations, and allowing us to be more people centric in the decision making and strategical pieces.
Am I next? I was asking a generative AI to answer this question for me. I think when I look at the sort of ethics of AI, I break it into the different applications of it. Joy, the decision making, and so you're talking about that we should be able to explain how we make decisions that impact people's lives. Can't just say it's a black box. And there's a whole move on like we need to create glass boxes and really challenging companies. And I think the really good companies using AI technology, they hold themselves to a higher standard even than their customers, and they welcome that explanation. So I think as HR, we should challenge people that come in with, hey, we got this magical staffing tool. It's like, explain. If an employee came down and said, how come I didn't get this job? How would I explain it? Put it this way. If the chairman of the board said, how come my nephew wasn't hired? How would I explain it to him? So I think there's that focus. I think on the second one, on the efficiency, Evelyn, that you're talking about, I think that raises some interesting, I don't know if they're ethics, but policy things. Like one, using AI to generate, let's say, job descriptions. If you asked a recruiter, hey, we need a job description, they said, why not? I just copied our competitors and I pasted it in. Would you be like, oh, that's okay? But that's kind of what these things are doing, right? They're just copying. And that's okay to use other things for inspiration, but to blindly copy them and not force us to go through the cognitive process of actually defining a job description. That's one of the reasons it's good to managers hate doing it, because it forces them to actually articulate what they want people to do. But that's why we do it. So I think there's an interesting thing on the, I don't know if it's ethics, but thinking about the creating content. The other one that I read a fascinating thing is the ethics of using it for support functions. That a big part of HR, there was a study done, I think it was by ADP, that showed that one of the big things that impacted trust and value in HR was there's someone in HR that actually knows my name. And if we go to chatbots, how many of us love it when we're struggling to get something done? We have a unique problem and we get like the phone tree of press 3, press 5, press 4. We just want to talk to a human, and AI can never care for a person, because caring is defined as a human giving time and their own life in the form of time and attention to another person. And I think we really have to be careful about how do we use AI to not take the caring side out, going back to the trust issue. And the last one, which I think is a much larger organizational thing of AI, is as it is transforming jobs, what is the obligation of a company to help employees make that transition versus, great, let's lay a bunch of people off and figure out. And I've seen real big differences within organizations in their ethics about, are we going to bring the workforce with us on this transition, which means we're going to have to spend the money and maybe move slower, but have a committed workforce? Or are we going to say, oh my God, implement it, fire a zillion people, we'll hire a bunch more? I think that's an ethical thing. But Evelyn, it goes back to what you said earlier. What are the ethics of the organization? I don't think there's a right or wrong. That's more of what kind of organization are you? So
I love how you wrap that one up, Steve, because I've been almost impatiently waiting for an opening to ask a question. I hope I heard right that there were some references to the company culture. So I would really invite all of you, let's take quite a few minutes and talk about the dynamics between ethics, HR ethics, and company culture. And I will just leave this question there, and wherever inspiration strikes, please come in. Who wants to go first?
I don't mind. I think it all ties hand in hand. And it goes back to my earlier conversation, knowing if you understand what your company ethics are, they're truly going to be what I call your company pillars, or, your company values, your goals. And, well, they should be. They should be what your company stands for. Excuse me. And I think HR, comes in with their own sets of principles and ethics, and they tie them all together to what the company is, as well as what their own are. And they should align. And where they don't align, I think that's where healthy conflict comes. Excuse me. And I think that's where healthy conflict comes. And in HR, you shouldn't be afraid to shy away from that. I think when you are afraid, that's when, you may need to readjust if that's the role for you. You may need to, because for me, I think conflict is a good thing. That means there's an issue and that we need to look at it, examine it, and we need to move forward and move past it. But that there is an issue that needs to be resolved. Right, wrong, or indifferent, we may not always agree on it, but we know that we reached a road bump and we need to get around it, through it, or however we get past it. But I think for ultimately the culture should align with what the company ethics are. And I think a lot of times that there is a mismatch in that. And so that's where a lot of dismal employee engagement comes in, or employee experiences are.
I completely agree with that. And I agree with what you said about, HR has to be invested in the company culture. I told my CEO when I interviewed for my current job, I said, if you make a wrong decision, I'm going to tell you about it. I'm going to tell you why it's wrong. So I'm happy that our company culture has shifted to where our ethical decisions are based on our values, our mission, vision, values. We live by our values every single day. And a lot of companies don't do that. They have a set of values, but they don't mean anything to them. They don't impact the work that the company does, how they treat their employees. And I think that's really important, because the culture should be based on values, the company values. And if the company doesn't have those values, and if they don't practice those values on a daily basis in every decision that they make, it's a problem, because then HR gets stuck in the middle and we have to defend those decisions. And it's hard. And like Evelyn said, if there's a conflict in between HR and the company ethics, that's not going to be a good fit, and it's going to be really, really difficult for that HR function or those HR folks to stay in those roles. It's going to be there's no solution. There's not going to be any good ending to that.
I think, and that's part of what we have a responsibility for when we're having those conversations, especially at the executive level and with management, is, when it's time to make some of these tough business decisions and ethics comes into play, does that reflect the core values that we've talked about and we've tried to embrace as an organization? How does this decision impact our culture? What does that look like? I'm fortunate enough to work in an organization that has embraced from all levels the core value of human. And so even when we're talking about things like generative AI and innovation, it doesn't mean that it takes away from the human experience. And what does that human experience look like? And how does that play into the day-to-day impact of an employee? So there's a lot of different ways that core values can be interpreted. You can have some really great words on the wall, but the interpretation and how that plays out in your business decisions and how you treat people is where the rubber meets the road in a day-to-day working environment. And so that's where it's really important to lean into. Whenever you have an opportunity to lean into core values, it can make the difference in how it shows up for employees and the impact that has on your culture as a whole.
Joy.
I definitely +1 to that. A statement. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
Am I back now?
After you said I definitely +1, and then we lost you.
Okay, I'm back. I was saying I definitely +1 to what Jamie was saying, in that core values, mission statements, vision statements, they are just going to be words on a paper if you do not actively hold yourself accountable for how you are navigating within that organization. That is what builds culture. When we talk about having a culture that is rooted in trust, psychological safety, it being inclusive, that does not start with just putting it on a paper. It happens at the top. So as HR, when we're talking about HR ethics and we're talking about the ethics of the organization, that's where I would say, as an HR department, and as an HR professional, get very clear on what your ethics are. I think we have a general understanding of like, what are the ethics that HR should have? But I think you have to go a little bit more in depth and granular as to how are you going to navigate, conduct, and action? And how are you then going to navigate that when you may come against that conflict, as Evelyn said, because it is going to happen. And that is where, as an HR professional, you are going to have that how can I say it? Conflict resolution skills to be able to put to the table that this is who we say we are. So are the actions aligning with that? And I saw a really good comment about when we were talking about the AI example, about how finance, they say a lot of tough things all the time and people listen, and about how and the comment was referencing about how HR needs to position itself. And I think that this is a wonderful question to really emphasize that, because there are some companies or organizations, they have incredible HR teams with wonderful ethics, but the organization, it may align differently. And so I would say that is where all of it has a holistic view of, first, you have to look at who you are as an HR professional, what is the ethics of the HR department, and then you have to measure that to what are the ethics of the organization and hold those leaders accountable for that. And that is how you are going to navigate and drive that culture.
Yeah, I kind of build on this, and what I'm really taking away from this conversation is we say ethics, but what we really mean is trust. And how do we maintain trust? Because that's what ethics drive is a trusting organization. And Joe, sort of, I like that analogy to finance, because I would say HR and finance are, first of all, we are support functions. There's nothing wrong with that. We help companies enable decisions and lean into that. But we're also the two most flexible resources a company has are money and people. You can spend money on anything. You can get people. Actually, people are really good at change. They may not always like it, but we can redirect people on anything. And you can't run a company without money, and you can't run a company without people. They're like the most critical and flexible resources organizations have. And in finance, the two things they're focusing on is, one, we can't break the laws, and two, we can't go broke. I think in HR, when it comes to ethics, is we can't break the laws and we can't violate trust. Because if we violate trust, that's the equivalent of going broke when it comes to culture and engagement. And because if you don't have trust, you don't have anything. And so when I look at it that way, I think it really is, when you get to your culture, Manola, it's having a clearly defined culture, and going back to what we talked about earlier, transparency about what it is. I remember at one point in my career, I did a culture study, and we found that work-life balance was associated with turnover. And the CEO, a manager, I was presenting it, and the manager goes, "Well, what should we do about this?" And I'm like, "Well, if you ask people to work less, they're going to work less. It's a trade-off." And the CEO got up and said, he goes, "I believe in a work-life balance. It's work life." And then he went on and said, "Look, we provide tremendous resources. We provide a lot of money if you work here." And he goes, "My belief is I love my work. I find things like the reason we have on-site healthcare is because I don't want to spend time driving to the dentist. I want to do it here because I want to be able to work." It's kind of like he leaned into that. One could argue if that's healthy or not, but it was their culture. He said, if you don't like that, if you're not like that, don't work here. But they were very upfront about it. And I think that where HR took a huge step back, in my own opinion, is when I don't want to get into the whole performance rating, but when we pretended that companies don't evaluate people. That was a massive blow for trust of organizations, because all these organizations, and I think leaders said, I don't want to do the process and the hard work of actually, whatever you want to call it, rating, evaluating, whatever, having transparent processes to make decisions about people that impact their lives. Let's just all bury it subjectively. I think that had such a step back, and I saw organizations just really struggle because we need to be transparent about, look, there's certain things our company expects, and if you work here, it's what we believe in, and we're going to be consistent on it. And it is, to some degree, a subjective decision, whether it's remote work or whatever. But companies owning that fact and going back to a little bit of like, mom and dad, why do I have to clean my room? Because our family believes in a clean room. I don't care, you're going to sleep in it tomorrow. That's just what it is to live in this family. I think there's an element that is clarity, and to some degree, it sounds a little bit matriarchal or patriarchal, depending whether mom or dad's saying it. But I think that's part of what employees want. They're like, just tell me the rules of the game, be consistent in it, and so I can live my life. Don't hide the stuff because it's hard to explain.
I'm going to say something very, very painful. We are 5 minutes away from wrapping this conversation up. And I so wish we could have just at least one more hour. I feel that we're just getting started on this topic that you have just amazing commitment to and energy for. I will use this last round as the open topic question. So I am absolutely sure that each and every one of you has something that's particularly meaningful and particularly important to you and you want to leave our audience with. Now, whether that's highlighting something that we already covered, or you want to bring a small new slice into the conversation, I would ask all of you, let's just take 1 minute each, and in the interest of time, I will pass the e-mic around. And Steve, you've been absolutely generous and gracious, taking the hot seat of going last for almost the entire conversation. I will ask you to be the first one, and we will do this counterclockwise. So something that is particularly meaningful to you.
I think the biggest is, there's a lot. Pay transparency. The ethics, if you're hiding how you pay and what you pay people, there's a reason for it. And I think I was in a study, we look at equity. I know this is a big thing and there's all kinds of challenges, but if companies literally made pay completely transparent, and some companies do, we would not have the equity issues that we've got. There'd be a lot of hard conversations, but really on HR, owning the fact that if we're hiding pay, it's because there is inequity and we don't want to have to explain certain things, and really pushing against that. Because either we tell them or they think they know from Glassdoor. So
thank you so very much, Steve. Jamie.
Humans are hard, and it's okay that you recognize that in HR. And so if you ever feel like you're in a situation where you don't know the right ethical decision to make, that's what community is for. Reach out to mentors, reach out to business leaders that you trust, reach out to other HR professionals. I wholeheartedly believe that our HR community collectively will be able to work together and push our profession forward with all of these challenges. And so that takes each of us leaning on each other whenever we find ourselves in those difficult dilemmas.
Thank you, Jamie. Joy.
I would say transparency and open communication goes a long way. And I know that can you hear me? I want to make sure I didn't cut out.
All good.
Okay, great. I know for HR that can typically be kind of hard, but I think when you can find the pockets to be open and transparent, your team is going to receive it so much better than trying to hide behind lofty words or very creative statements. People want to know the truth so that they can understand where they fit in the big picture. And when we're talking about ethics and we're talking about integrity, and as Steve has said, we're talking about trust, people deserve that. That is how you action those ethics you say you have.
Thank you. Sue.
I think so. The biggest thing for me with ethics and in HR is that you have to, going into HR, you have to know what your own ethics are. You have to know how much you're willing to bend either way, and find a company that complements your own ethical values. And finally, if there is an ethical decision that the higher leadership wants to make, be strong enough to push back a little and guide that decision in an ethical way. So you have to force your seat at the table per se, and be strong enough to push back and speak up.
Thank you. Evelyn. You're on mute.
Of course. I couldn't agree more with what everyone said. And I'll just piggyback and echo in that I wholeheartedly believe transparency, communication, and honesty will push ethics forward. And echoing what Sue just said, understanding what your limits are so you can know what you can and cannot take. And, being able to enforce that, transparently across where you work at is going to be critical. And I know, like, using myself as personally, some things I just won't do. And I know that just won't be the company for me if that's where they continue down. And I'm okay with that and moving forward. And I think more people need to be okay with understanding that and moving forward as well.
Evelyn, Sue, Joy, Jamie, and Steve, it was an amazing hour. Thank you so very much for taking the time and the energy to be here and share your insights. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for being here, either now live or later on as you find us in the recording. And please keep in mind, tomorrow you are in for a treat, the same time slot, but the topic will be emotional agility. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Jessa, for taking care of us. And you all enjoy a wonderful rest of your day, of your week, and of the month. And I hope I will get to welcome as many of you as possible very, very soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
We did.